Whispers turned to roars inside Buckingham Palace as King Charles made the unthinkable move, forcing Queen Camilla to step away from royal life amid allegations of a covert bid for the throne. Behind closed doors, courtiers spoke of palace warfare and a queen who would not wait her turn. In the shadows, Camilla was said to be rallying loyalists, her influence stretching far beyond the gilded walls. She underestimated his resolve, murmured one insider, and he underestimated her patience. This decision has left Britain to wonder, has this royal battle truly ended, or is the most dangerous act still to come? The glittering lie. The chandelier is in the grand hall of Buckingham Palace cast a golden glow over the polished marble floors, their light bouncing off crystal glasses and jeweled gowns. It was one of those evenings meant to be photographed, documented, and broadcast as the perfect image of royal unity. King Charles stood beside Queen Camilla, his posture impeccable, his expression warm enough to fool the untrained eye. Camilla, draped in an emerald gown that shimmered under the lights, or the kind of smile that had been perfected through decades of public life, elegant, poised, and entirely rehearsed. The cameras clicked like a chorus of mechanical crickets, capturing a tableau of harmony that did not in truth exist. Behind the glimmering facade, tensions simmered like a storm just over the horizon, unseen but inevitable. From the outside, the king and queen seemed unstepped, moving through the crowd, his one greeting dignitaries and laughing at polite jokes. Had anyone paying close attention might have noticed the fractures, tiny, almost invisible to those who wanted to believe in the fairy tale. Charles, his eyes often drifted away mid-conversation, as though his mind was somewhere far from the glitter and noise. Camilla laughter came, a heartbeat, to laid her hand resting on his arm, not out of affection, but out of obligation. A seasoned royal correspondent watching from the edge of the room would later remark that there was something brittle about the scene, like porcelain ready to crack. The truth was, Charles had begun to feel the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. As the evening progressed, he found his gaze wandering towards the great arched windows where the city lights twinkled against the night. He thought of how different it all had felt in his early reign, when he still believed that the crown would bring unity to his family and peace to his marriage. Now there was a shadow over that vision, an ache that he couldn't either ignore nor fully define. He could feel Camilla, his presence beside him, yet it felt like there was a wall between them, built brick by brick over the past months. Each polite smile they exchanged for the benefit of the crowd only reminded him of how hollow the gesture had become. Camilla, for her part, was aware of the distance till she had mastered the art of appearing serene, but in the quiet moments when her eyes met Charles, there was a flash, something sharp, guarded. She had learned that in this world appearances were everything. A marriage could be fraying at the seams, yet if you smiled the right way and wore the right jewels, the world would believe it was perfect. Still, the strain was there. A forced laughter rang too loudly. At times her hand would tighten ever so slightly on her clutch and arise with dart to the press photographers, as if ensuring they caught her at just the right angle. To anyone else it was elegance, to Charles it was a performance. As the music swelled and the crowd shifted toward the ballroom for the evening's toast, the king's private secretary leaned discreetly toward the monarch. His voice was low, barely more than a breath. If only the public knew what was really going on. The words were swallowed by the laughter and clinking glasses, but they struck Charles like a dart. He said nothing, and reply only nodded faintly, his lips pressed into a thin line. It was a dangerous thought, one that lingered like smoke in his mind. In the far corner of the room, a senior palace insider, a man who had served the monarchy for more than 3 decades, watched the pair glide through their obligations. Later, when speaking to a trusted journalist off the record, he would sum it up with chilling precision: in this family, power is never simply given, it's taken. Those words would echo in the corridors of the palace in the weeks to come, a prophecy dressed as an observation for Now they hung unspoken in the air, masked by this soft melodies of the orchestra and the polite murmur of royal small talk. The evening passed in a blur of formalities, speeches, toasts, carefully orchestrated photographs, but to Charles it felt as though every moment was weighed down by an invisible heaviness when the last guest finally departed, and the great hall fell silent. The king stood alone for a moment, staring at the empty space where the glittering cry, "Wow!" had been. The scent of perfume still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint tang of champagne. Somewhere in the palace Camilla had retreated to, or private rooms, and for the first time that night Charles allowed the mask to slip. His shoulders sagged, his eyes dimmed. Something was coming, he could feel it. And when it arrived, it would change everything. Whispers of a plot. The palace at night was a different world entirely. The grand corridors, bustling with aides and attendants during the day, fell into a hush, their silence broken only by the distant ticking of a clock or the echo of footsteps on marble. It was during these hours, when the rest of the household slept, that Queen Camilla held her most curious meetings. In the soft glow of lamplight in her private drawing room, she would pour a generous measure of wine and settle into a chair opposite a trusted confidant. The curtains were always drawn tight, and the door was gone. Ordered by one of her most loyal staff members, instructed to admit no one uninvited, their conversations were conducted in low tones, punctuated by Camilla's sharp, knowing laugh. "He means well," she once murmured to a close friend, "but meaning well is not the same as ruling well." The words were heavy with implication, and those who heard them would never forget. The whispers began in the palace corridors. Soon after, staff members moving between offices and private quarters would catch fleeting fragments of conversations they were not meant to hear. One evening, a maid passing by the Queen's sitting room caught the words, "He's too soft for this role, far too soft." Another time, a footman delivering a sealed envelope to one of Camilla's aides overheard, "If someone doesn't take charge, this whole thing will come apart." The palace had seen intrigue before, every royal household did, but there was something different about this. The whispers didn't fade, they spread like ink and water. They seeped into every corner of the royal estate until it seemed that everyone from the junior valets to the most senior courtiers had heard some version of the say. Rumor the Queen was positioning herself for more than just influence. The outside world soon began to sense something amiss. Seemingly out of nowhere, certain newspapers began running curious stories. They praised Queen Camilla's decisiveness, her ability to lead, and her clear vision for the monarchy. These glowing profiles often appeared alongside far less flattering pieces about King Charles, articles that painted him as indecisive, hesitant, or overly sentimental. A leader must have strength above all else. Read one headline conspicuously quoting a senior palace source without naming names. In another piece, an unnamed insider claimed Camilla is ready to step in if necessary. The coordination was too precise to be coincidence. "It's not the press sniffing out a story," one seasoned royal watcher remarked. "It's someone feeding it to them." Inside the palace, the shift in the press coverage did not go unnoticed. In the king's private study, a stack of clippings sat on his desk, the headlines glaring up at him like accusations. He would run a hand over his face, sighing heavily, and ask aloud to no one in particular, "Why now? Why this?" His aides, however, had begun to form their own theories. One of them, a courtier who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, asked to speak with the king in confidence. The meeting took place late in the afternoon when the palace was quieter, the sun slanting through the tall windows. "Your Majesty," the man began, choosing his words with care, "she's building her own court inside the palace." Charles, his brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. "What exactly are you saying?" The aide hesitated, then delivered the warning, and for she's surrounding yourself with people loyal to her first, the crown second, and you last. Even those closest to Camilla began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. At official events, she carried herself with a nice that bordered on command, stepping forward to greet guests before the king had the chance. At meetings, she was quick to voice their opinions, sometimes cutting across Charles's sentences. "I'm only being practical," she would say with a shrug, though there was often a glint in her eye that suggested something more deliberate. Those who had attended her private gatherings noticed the guest list growing longer: advisors, journalists, political figures, many of whom had little business being at Buckingham Palace in the first place. When asked about it, Camilla brushed it off as just good networking. The palace staff, ever attuned to the shifting winds of power, began to adday. Some aides quietly aligned themselves with Camilla's circle, seeing and her a figure who might soon wield greater authority. Others kept their distance, wary of being caught on the wrong side of the balance tip. "She plays the long game," one former staff member would later say, shaking his head. "And Charles, he doesn't even see the board." It was not said with malice, but with the weary resignation of someone who had witnessed too many palace games to be surprised by another. Still, the king could not shake the growing unease. It was not only the whispered remarks or the flattering press coverage, it was the feeling deep in his bones that something shifting beneath his feet. At night he would walk the long corridors alone, the portraits of his ancestors watching from the walls. He thought of the history they represented: monarchs who had faced rebellions, betrayals, and power struggles of their own. He wondered if they would have seen what was happening now, if they would have acted sooner. And he wondered, perhaps most painfully, if he had been blind for too long. In the days that followed, the tension thickened like fog. Conversations hushed when the king entered a room. Certain courtiers began meeting behind closed doors, with Camilla emerging with tight-lipped smiles. The king's schedule was suddenly filled with engagements that kept him away from the palace for hours at a time, appointments that some suspected were arranged without his full consent. "She's creating a vacuum," one of his loyal aides warned, "and the moment you step out of it, she's stepping in." Camilla, meanwhile, appeared entirely untroubled by the shifting dynamics. If anything, she seemed energized at public appearances. She spoke with confidence, sometimes fielding questions meant for the king. In interviews, she would praise his service, but always with a faintly patronizing edge, as though speaking of someone whose best years were behind him. "Charles has a good heart," she told one reporter with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But sometimes a steady hand is needed on the wheel." The remark made headlines the next morning, and though it was couched as affection, its undertone was unmistakable. The king's most trusted confidant tried to rally him, urging him to assert his authority before it was too late. But Charles, ever cautious, hesitated. To act too aggressively might fuel the very rumors he wished to quash. To do nothing, however, might allow them to grow unchecked. The palace had entered dangerous territory, one where perception could be as powerful as truth, and in that realm Camilla was proving herself to be a master player. Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, the game had begun in earnest. Every smile, every public remark, every carefully placed story in the press was another move in a match only a few could see, and for the king sensed it now, even if he had not at first. This was no ordinary strain and a royal marriage. This was something calculated, deliberate, something that, if left unanswered, could change the very shape of the monarchy. And as the corridors whispered and the headlines mounted, one question hung unspoken in the air: how long before the game stopped being played in shadows and erupted into the light? The breaking point. It began with something as small and unassuming as a folded sheet of paper. King Charles had been reviewing his morning correspondence in his private study, sifting through the usual mix of official documents, handwritten notes from well-wishers, and briefing papers. At the bottom of the pile, beneath a stack of invitations, lay a letter sealed in cream-colored stationery bearing a crest. He recognized a high-ranking political ally whose loyalty, it always seemed unquestionable curiosity, drew him to open it, and as his eyes scanned the neatly typed paragraphs, the words seemed to twist and dark, and before him it spoke of future leadership, of ensuring stability for the monarchy, and of transition plans that must be discreet. Yet, what struck him most were the lines in Camilla, his own hand scrawled, and the margin, "The crown must be in capable hands. I am ready when the time comes." Charles read those words again and again, his heart pounding, the meaning unmistakable. For a long moment he sat frozen in his chair, the paper trembling in his grip. Outside his window the gardens were bathed in soft spring sunlight, an almost mocking contrast to the storm gathering inside him. This was not idle gossip or overheard rumor. This was written proof, and Camilla, his own script of her willingness, her intention to step into a role that was not hers. He thought back to every strange remark, every sidelong glance, every whispered conversation he had dismissed as palace chatter. Now they all fit together like pieces of a puzzle he wished he had never solved. Only hours later, as if the letter alone were not enough, the second blow landed. One of his senior aides entered his study with a look so grave that Charles knew before a word was spoken that it was bad news. "Your Majesty," the aide said quietly, "you need to hear this for yourself." From a small recorder came the unmistakable voice of Queen Camilla. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, as she spoke to an unknown confidant. "His health is not what it once was," she said. "The strain is showing. Someone has to think of the monarchy's future, and if I must take charge for the good of the institution, then so be it." There was no malice in her tone, but there was certainty, the kind that carry the weight of intent. Charles listened to the recording twice, then a third time, each repetition stoking the heat in his chest. It was not simply what she had said, but the ease with which he had said it, as though the idea of supplanting him was not treachery, but duty. He thought of the years they had spent together, the public battles fought to defend their marriage, the careful construction of their shared image. Now, with a few sentences, she had revealed her willingness to undo it all for the good of the monarchy. She had said the words burned like acid. When the aide left, closing the heavy wooden door behind him, Charles rose from his chair. He moved to the sideboard where a crystal decanter of brandy waited, pouring himself a glass with unsteady hands. He stared at the amber liquid for a moment before setting it down on. Touched his reflection in the dark and window, looked older, more tired, and he had ever noticed before. The rage came swiftly unbidden. He swept the glass from the sideboard, sending it shattering against the floor. The sharp crack of breaking crystal echoed in the study, followed by the sound of his own ragged breathing. After everything, he muttered under his breath, gripping the edge of his desk as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. It was not long before he summoned those he trusted most. His son William arrived first, the concern on his face deepening as soon as he saw the state of the study, the broken glass, the scattered papers, the air thick with unspoken anger. "Father," he began cautiously, "what's happened?" Charles handed the letter without a word. William read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. Then the king played the recording. When it ended, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the recorder winding down. William set it on the desk, his eyes dark. "Your stepmother," Charles finally said, his voice low but cutting. "She would crown herself if she could. Not long after Princess and joined them. Her entrance was brisk, her eyes sharp as they scanned her brother's face. "You look as though you've been at war," she said, closing the door behind her. "Perhaps I have," Charles replied bitterly, sliding the letter across the desk, and read it with the same stoic composure that had carried her through decades of royal duty, but the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed her fury. "This is no accident," she said at last. "Letters like this aren't misplaced. They're meant to be found, or they're meant to be kept hidden forever. Either way, it tells us exactly where she stands." The three of them spoke in hushed but urgent tones, the gravity of the moment sinking in. "We cannot act rashly," William cautioned, though his clenched fists suggested he was as angry as his father, and however was less inclined toward restraint. "You've been too careful for too long, Charles. This," she tapped the letter with one finger, "is not something we can ignore. You must decide now whether you will confront her or whether you'll let her continue until there's nothing left to defend." Charles listened, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. He felt as though the very walls of the palace were pressing in on him, carrying the weight of centuries of royal conflict. He thought of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, and the quiet strength she had wielded. What would she have done in his place? Would she have waited, hoping for reconciliation, or acted decisively to protect the crown? For the rest of that night, the king, his heir, and his sister remained in the study, their voices alternating between tense whispers in short bursts of frustration. The letter lay between them on the desk, the recording device beside it, a pair of silent witnesses to betrayal. Charles knew that when the sun rose, the decisions made in these hours would set the course for everything that followed. But as the fire burned low, and the palace beyond the study sank into silence, one truth settled heavily over him. The ever love or trust had once lived between him and Camilla had been replaced by something else entirely, and once replaced, he suspected it could never be restored: the royal confrontation. The palace was steeped in shadows that night, the kind of deep, restless darkness that seemed to carry weight. Outside, rain lashed against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, its rhythmic pounding a steady, relentless drumbeat that echoed. The storm brewing within the corridors was silent, the usual hum of staff activity long gone, leaving only the distant toll of a clock marking each passing second. In his private quarters, King Charles stood by the window, staring out at the glistening courtyard. Below, the flickering light of the fireplace cast his face in sharp relief. The lines of age, deepened by the burden of what he had discovered tonight, would not, and in silence tonight, the truth, however ugly, would be laid bare. Camilla entered the room with the air of someone entirely unaware, her emerald dressing gown swaying gently as she crossed